even speaks to us on alone.
Bonjour tout le monde. We are going to consider, I've got to share my slides as well, like Owen. Just tell me if it's working. Is everyone? I've put it into slide view. You're good? You're going to probably find that your faces are over the text. There is a way to get rid of that. If you're in Zoom, you go to the little block and you'll see a little minimize block. If you don't want to see me, you can minimize me. I will not take offense. You can either take the second block, which will allow me to stay on and no one else. And that way you should be able to see all the text. So I will do that myself, just so that I can see what's going on. All right. So this subject on alone, and I think it's quite interesting that each of us came from different angles, but effectively came up with a similar approach. And for me, that approach is around this thing of isolation. If you can see on the slides, I'll try and make it less. I've been considering the subject of connectedness in some talks that I'm working on at the moment. And then Corona came along, and the whole talk was about social distancing and isolation and lockdown. And that is the flip side of connectedness. So then I started looking at this topic. And for me, it was a real God moment when Matthew contacted me, because I was, and I don't know why my slides are not moving now. Let's have a look. There. I was watching there's on YouTube, there's a channel called Wonder, and they play a lot of real life stories. And I just watched about a guy who had been stuck in a jungle for almost 3 weeks. And in that time he was stuck in the jungle, he almost went crazy, which it says at the bottom of the slide there. And his big thing was not the lack of water, because he didn't have much water, and the lack of food. His biggest thing was the isolation. No other human to talk to for 3 weeks, and that started to work on his mind. And so this thing of isolation came out again in another God moment. And then I read it in the scriptures, because I'm following a different reading timetable to some of you in Leviticus, and we'll look at that just now. But the thing about isolation is that it's been a way of people for hundreds of years as a way of punishing people. So there's an isolation cell. Why is it so difficult for us to be put in an isolation cell? An isolation cell has a sensory and proximity isolation. So you're not seeing light, and you don't know what time of day it is. But if you ask any prisoner who's been put in an isolation cell, they will say it's a terrible form of punishment. So we have this part of our makeup that makes isolation feel really terrible. And that's obvious around the world, because everyone is freaking out about, now I'm having to stay at home, I'm in lockdown. So why is it that we feel this so much? So why is being connected so important to us? And that was the question that was going through my mind. And this subject is brought up right in the beginning in Genesis. God in Genesis recognized that we have this innate desire to be connected. The Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. So he was talking about Eve to Adam, but this principle is it's not good for man to be alone. So we have this innate desire to be connected with people, with things, with groups, with things going around us. So from that principle, from this point, I started to think, well, why are we created like this? Why is it so important to us? If you look in some species in the animal kingdom, some of them don't need to socialize. Some do, of course, but a lot don't. But we as humans is something that is almost like death to us, and something we can't really cope with. So I started going through, I see my internet connection is unstable, but we'll keep going. I started looking at the subject and delving into this principle of being alone and being isolated. And one of the scriptures that I found to be very interesting is found for us in Ecclesiastes 4, 7 to 12. I'm not going to read it because I've got a few slides to get through, and you're welcome to read it later. And I've called it the four faces of the alone man. And in Ecclesiastes 4, Solomon describes 4 different types of characteristics of being alone and what it does to us, as human beings, and what the end result is. And the first one that he highlights is the selfish man. Now, he talks about a man that has no brother or no child or son, who works continuously, putting all his effort into building his wealth, but has no one to give it to. And this is something that, as you look around in the world today, people, and I think Owen mentioned it, people who have used their money to support them, suddenly they're in this position where it may not help them. And people who have no family are really isolated. And the question he asks, he says, but isn't this meaningless? You're building all this wealth, but you have nothing beyond that. And it's getting down to that need for us as humans to have a purpose beyond ourselves. So the issue of being the selfish man is you don't have a purpose beyond yourself. And that really makes your loneliness extreme. The second face is the fallen man. I could go on forever about these 4 faces, by the way, but anyhow, I won't. In the fallen man is talking about when something goes wrong in your life, how do you deal with it? When you fall down, if there's no one to pick you up, and that speaks to our need for support. No matter who you are, at some stage in your life, you are going to need someone to support you, to pick you up. When life's gone wrong, when you've fallen, if you're alone, it's a terrible position to be in and have no one to pick you up from where you've fallen in life. So that's the second face of the fallen person. The third I've called the cold man. That may create a few chuckles. The cold man he talks about if you lie down by yourself, you're going to get cold. And there's no one to warm you. And the principle here is our need as human beings to have intimate relationships, to have close, intimate relationships. And this is something that if you see someone who's alone, this is something that they feel powerfully. And we may feel all of these, we may know people who have all of these, but we also see, if you've ever experienced this, if you're alone and you miss that human contact, it's something that is really difficult to deal with. And the fourth face is the overpowered man. And in this last part, he talks about being able to be defended, to have someone to defend us. And the overpowered man for me is referring to that feeling that sometimes we have, and many of us may have it right now, is when you have this tsunami of problems, issues facing us, and one after the next wave hits you. You just can't cope anymore. Mentally, you cannot cope anymore. And you want a defense. You want someone to help you. And there's nothing worse than being alone where there's no one else to help you out of this dark place that you've gone. Your mind is being overpowered. So in Ecclesiastes, he puts together quite succinctly, Solomon, that these are the 4 faces of being alone. It's not a pretty picture. It's not something, and his conclusion is, this is not what you want. You don't want to be the selfish man or the fallen man or the cold man or the overpowered man. You want to be connected to something. And that's exactly what God was saying in Genesis. It's not good that man is alone. We don't cope well with it. We have to be part of something bigger. So with that on mind, I was exploring a few other things and this is the chapter that caught my attention in my readings. Now, this could be almost verbatim, as in the past, what would happen if coronavirus had existed during the time that the children of Israel were crossing in the wilderness. Anyone with a defiling skin disease, or any disease for that matter, must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover their lower parts of their face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. With a bit of poetic license, cover the lower part of their face. I'm sure you would recognize what that could be. You know these things, masks. So, and the principles were the same. It was for hygiene, that you would do this. And I must admit, I've seen people whose clothes look unkept, who are wearing masks, who are running around probably under their breath shouting unclean. But the principle here was that this was an important hygiene factor that was in the camp. But I started looking at this from our principle, from our lives. You know, in our lives, we come from a point where we've been defiled by sin. Our lives, in many cases, are messy and shameful, and we cry out that we are sinners. And because of that, we feel alone. That's where we've come from. So there's a spiritual lesson. When you face all these real day things like in the coronavirus, flip it around and look at it from a spiritual perspective. Be reminded of the defiled sin that we came from the messy lives we came from, for the fact that we cried, unclean, I'm a sinner, and that we were alone. And you know the obvious second part of that, but I wanted to just give a warning before I moved off on that. Because we have a tendency within our ecclesias and within our community to create times of people being alone. And this is a warning to all of us. The way we talk about people, the way we judge people, people who are trying to come to Jesus, we look at them in a funny way, we say the wrong things about them so that they always feel a sinner. And then we have people in our communities that we believe have done things that make them sinners, and we kick them out and we say, you're unclean, go outside the camp. And we create the coronaviruses of our spirituality. And it's a warning for us to be very careful of doing that, because we know it's by the grace of God that we take the hand, the outstretched hand of Jesus. That's the hand that saved us. That's the hand that saves us now. And I was cleansed by this hand, and I'm no longer alone. And that's the most powerful and inspirational message I can give you, because even Jesus himself, as he approached the crucifixion, realized how important this was. Just as a little aside, I'm not suggesting that quality alone time is wrong. Jesus did it. He went for short periods of time for connection, for communing, for revival of his spirit. And we need to do that as well. But Jesus' test in the wilderness was extended period of being alone, so it was tough for him. But the positive message for us is that Jesus himself, he knew that at the end, when the chips were down, he would be left alone by those whom he had trusted. But in the end, he had came to this conclusion: I am not alone, for my Father is with me. And that's the message we take away tonight as we go into the world. So that's me. I will stop sharing and hand over back to Matthew.
Thanks, Steve. Oh, that was really powerful. And I think maybe I think back to the time that you were exiled to out of Benin. I mean, did you maybe just, I mean, that must have been a time that tested you in being alone.
Yeah, being alone is rough. Yeah, so I lived, some of you know, I lived in Lagos in Nigeria for 6 months, and I lived in a hotel for 6 months. And being alone is rough, because the problem is you have no one to share things with. So if you don't keep that connection and realize that you're not ultimately alone, you have someone that you can connect with, and that's our Heavenly Father. It's actually soul destroying. It's unbelievable. You lose energy, and you actually start to question everything about yourself. And when the family would come down once a month for a weekend, it's like the highlight of your life, because you so being alone is not nice. So if you've ever had extended period of being alone, all those four phases, you would understand what it means.